privilege to have Meredith here today. I've had the chance to interview Meredith, and it's been a very enriching experience. So put your hands together for Meredith. And get on with the talk. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam, and I'm very impressed that all of you are here early on a Sunday morning, so thank you. Yes, look, just to put myself in context, I feel as though I'm a bit of an interloper at a conference like this because I do not have a background in technology. I'm an interested user, and I find sitting in the audience yesterday, listening to some of the speakers there, it's really at the leading edge of technology and science and the way that that interacts with human society. So I'm not an expert in that sort of arena, that field. But what I do know something about is business. Adam started to introduce me, and most of my background, most of my career has been in the corporate world. I've been in big corporations, in mining and manufacturing and in banking. And in the last 10 years or so, I've had what's called a portfolio career, which is a number of appointments to company boards, both in the government sector and in the commercial sector, and not-for-profit organisations, including the Rationalist Society. So I do know something about business, and I know something about big business. And what I thought I'd share with you is just one aspect of the way that a very influential player in the world, that is big business, big corporations, view technology. Because I think that all of us can become very narrow in what we focus on. What I'm hoping to do with this talk is to remind you that even though you may be focusing on your area of speciality, or indeed your area of interest, that there are other people out there with very different interests and specialities, and they have power, and they will shape the world, just as much as you will. So, this is just one very small journey into the role of business, or the role of the way that big business views technology in society. I do have a PhD. My research was in organisational theory, and in particular in the nature of organisational sustainability. It was looking at how can we run organisations to meet the expectations of various stakeholders in organisations. How can we run that now without jeopardising the capacity of the future generation of that company to meet the needs of future stakeholders? Now, you might recognise here the definition of sustainable development. And that definition of sustainable development came out of the United Nations Commission on the Future, so-called Brundtland Report, in 1987. And that was, sustainable development was meeting the needs of the present without jeopardising the capacity of a future generation to meet its own needs. So without going into the details or the results of my thesis, one of the areas of methodology that I looked at was looking at futures techniques. And one of these was scenario planning. That's what I intend to take you through this morning, just one exercise in scenario planning. So scenario planning had its origins in the 1950s in the Rand Corporation. Many of you probably have heard about the Rand Corporation, but interestingly enough, Rand doesn't come from James Randi, or it actually just comes from R&D, research and development. But there was a scientist there called Herman Kahn who pioneered a technique which he called future now thinking. And his reports read more like stories, more like science fiction, or at least stories written by an author who was living in the future, looking back. And then this technique was taken up later and further developed by corporations, and in particular by the Shell company. And they use this technique to prepare their organisations for aspects of the future that may not be obvious. So that they were trying to get the senior leaders in those organisations to think about possible futures that were not merely extrapolations of what they were already familiar with. There are three major steps to go through in developing future scenarios. The first one was to focus on a particular topic. The second was to analyse the driving forces, some of which are known, like geography, some may be unknown. And then to use this analysis to draw up plausible, pertinent stories, alternatives about the future. It was really more concerned with strategic thinking than strategic planning, changing mindsets. Now, in the late 1990s, which is when I was doing my PhD research, there was an organisation called, or still is an organisation called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and they used scenario planning to develop a series of scenarios about the future over the next 50 years. It was done by the head of Shell's Scenario Planning Division in consultation with about 30 of the largest corporations in the world. And these scenarios were quite influential at the time. So I thought that it might be interesting to just give you a flavour of what big business, big corporations were thinking 10 years ago about the future of technology and its role in the future. Okay, so this is just a journey through one set of scenarios developed by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And their focus was how could we possibly think about a future world in 50 years that would be sustainable. There were some things that they said that they did know. Things were getting better. Over the last 50 years, life expectancy had increased in developing countries, for example. Life expectancy had increased from 47 years to 62 years. Basic education in developing countries was catching up to that in developed countries. It had increased, basic education had increased from 25% to 70%. And over the last 50 years, while the population had doubled, per capita income had tripled. So from one perspective, things were getting better. But the problem was that all this was putting a lot of stress on the world's ecosystems. There were threats like loss of grazing land, forests, habitat destruction, and so on, and of course climate change. So all of these were known at the time to be putting stress on the world's ecosystems. What they didn't know was whether or not these threats would spread and become a real threat to the overall survival of the world. So they didn't quite know whether or not things ought to be done about it now or whether the world would fix itself. There were two major aspects they suggested in this analysis that they didn't know. And one was, what are the critical thresholds to the world's ecosystems? And we still don't know. what are these critical thresholds. But also, what we don't know is what are the best social systems that can respond to these challenges. So it's not obvious how we can organise ourselves as humans socially and politically to ensure sustainable development. So this was the givens and some of the unknowns. Then what were the driving forces? And they identified them as three major ones: the new, the many, and the connected. The new is what you've been talking about today, in particular about innovation in technology. But it's not only innovation in technology. Over the last 10 years or so, there's been innovations socially. Some of you may have heard about the Grameen Bank, which is a very different way of doing banking that's been very successful in developing countries. There's also innovation or newness in the geopolitical sphere. 50 years ago, there were about 50 members of the United Nations. There's now about 200 members of the United Nations. So there are numbers, and therefore complexity is increasing in the geopolitical area. The many, this is probably a variety, an aspect of graphs that you've all seen before. Human population is at about 7 billion now. Over the next 50 years, it's proposed that it will move to about 9.2 billion. I guess one aspect that you could say is somewhat helpful or hopeful is that the rate of increase is decreasing. But even if that's true, material consumption will increase substantially over the next 50 years, and that will put increasing stress on the world's ecosystems. And of course, because the number of nations and other groupings within society is increasing, the interactions and the interdependencies within those groupings will become correspondingly more complex. And finally, the connected, which Randall was talking about yesterday, just one aspect of it. The problem with this, yes, we're becoming much more connected, which means that around the world, the rate of knowledge, the rate and the substance of knowledge shared has increased a lot. And the way that problems have been perceived can be shared much more quickly. The problem is that the rate of solving those problems hasn't changed. Problem-solving institutions have not changed. Problem-solving institutions like parliaments, for example, haven't changed for decades, even centuries. So the result is that people are becoming more frustrated, more disillusioned. We don't know where those negative feelings are going to go. So we have the driving forces of innovation in technology, in society. We have increasing numbers of humans in the world, increasing groupings of humans in the world, and we have increasing connectedness. Now, the Business Council put all these things together, and they developed 3 alternative scenarios about how this is going to show up in the future. 3 stories, if you like, which they called Frog, Geopolity and Jazz. I'm just going to read to you the stories of these 3 scenarios. The world of frog is a familiar word. is a familiar world, at least at first. Many nations experience a fair degree of economic success, and for almost all, economic growth is the major concern. With sustainable development acknowledged to be important, but it's not pressing. Environmental NGOs continue to demand enforcement of standards. Nations who are striving to develop argue that if developed nations first insist on raising environmental standards, they should first raise our growth. So FROG stands for First Raise Our Growth. This is the future where the China and the Brazil and the Russia and the India of the world say to the first world, don't try to change what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase our living standards. Once we get to the same living standards that you have, then maybe we'll think about changing environmental standards so that we don't pollute so much. People value sustainable development in the FROG scenario, but it's not a top priority. And in addition, in the early years, environmental health in many areas improves significantly. The improvement in local air quality, in solid waste management, in environmental education leads to the perception that the environment is in much better shape than it was in the late 1990s. But at a global level, the picture is less clear. With economic growth and the increase in population, greenhouse gases are rising unnoticed by most. Remember, they're writing this back in 10 years ago. The signals at first are difficult to read, and people disagree about what they might mean. Both the difficulty and the disagreement are for good reasons, it's felt, to continue to raise our growth. But by 2050, there's evidence that the darkest predictions about global warming are actually nearer to the truth than the more optimistic ones. In the FROG scenario, the habitual reliance on technology has not been sufficient to solve the longer-term problems of either environmental or social health. Globalisation and liberalisation of the markets, along with the pressures of rapid urbanisation, have raised the degree of social inequity and unrest to a level that threatens basic survival of both human and environmental ecosystems. In this scenario, people react like the proverbial frog. When placed in boiling water, the frog leaped out in danger. But placed in cold water that's gradually heated to the boiling point, the complacent frog was boiled to death. So this is the first scenario that they've suggested. The second one they've called Geo Ecology, which begins with a succession of signals in the first 2 decades, some real, some imagined, that an environmental and social crisis looms. The prevailing economic myth is increasingly viewed as dangerously narrow. This is particularly true in Asia, where rapid economic growth has meant that corners have been cut and traditions lost. Many institutions, especially governments, have lost credibility as problem solvers. So people come to expect something else. They look to the multinationals, to business, but the multinational solutions are not trusted. And eventually the polity, that is civil society around the world, eventually accepts that there is a new form of power that is required. They call it the Global Ecosystem Organisation. It could be, for example, a new form of United Nations, something that has the power to impose technocratic solutions and the power to impose more market controls. In Geo Ecology, the government, they suggest, the governments are rejuvenated as focal points of civil society. Governments seek to work with markets rather than to displace them, but they take the lead in shifting the structure of the economy towards sustainable development in conjunction with institutions such as Geo, hence Geo Ecology. In other words, this is suggesting that instead of just a continuation of what we know now, which was the previous frog scenario, there is almost of necessity the development of a new centralised power, the Geo organisation. And then the third one they call jazz. So in the world of jazz, diverse players join in ad hoc alliances to solve social and environmental problems in the most pragmatic way possible. The keynote of this scenario is dynamic reciprocity. This is a world of social and technological innovations, experimentation, rapid adaptation, and voluntary interconnectedness, and a powerful and ever-changing global market. What enables the quick learning and subsequent innovation in jazz is high transparency, the widespread availability of information about ingredients of products, sources of inputs, company financial, environmental and social data, government decision-making processes, and almost anything else concerned consumers want to know. Many players are involved, in part because of the way information technology lowers barriers to entry. This allows new actors to step onto the economic stage, and that stage itself is characterised by a global free market, sound legal systems, and respect for property rights. To the extent that government is involved, it's most active at the local level, with ad hoc global institutions arising to solve particular problems. Agreements are reached through mediation in a world in which transparency is required, but particular green behaviours are not, even though such behaviours will be rewarded. The achievement of new environmental and social standards occurs largely out of self-interest. The public is made aware of transgressions and quickly acts against companies or countries that violate standards. Companies have an interest in seeing that disputes don't escalate and indirectly harm them. They monitor relationships with customers and suppliers closely, and they drop risky partners quickly. In this highly competitive and interconnected world, businesses see strategic economic advantages in being perceived as environmentally and socially responsible, and many become proactive leaders in responding to social and environmental challenges. Jazz is a world in which NGOs, governments, concerned consumers and businesses act as partners or they fail. Together, along with other players, they learn effective ways of incorporating environmental and social values into market mechanisms. Now, I think you can tell from those three scenarios that this was not a value-free exercise. They were clearly trying to influence the leaders in these organisations towards one or other of these scenarios. And in particular, the message was that the frog scenario, that is, continuation of where they were in 1990 forward for the next 50 years, that it was unsustainable. And in fact, they analysed that if nothing else happened, if it was simply an extrapolation of the current ways of doing business and social and political institutions, then by 2050, the world will be consuming 2.3 Earth's worth of ecosystem materials and ecosystem services. Clearly unsustainable. But more to that, so the frog scenario they suggested is not the one that we should choose. But then there is a choice between geopolity or jazz. And I think you can tell from the way that they were described, it was clear that the Business Council was trying to get their constituency, business leaders, to realise that unless they worked with NGOs, unless they valued environmental and social values, then it was likely that something else would happen. And that is, there would be the emergence of a new form of power, a new centralised power that will not necessarily work with the market, that will impose solutions on business. And this is something that business doesn't want. So it was clearly not a value-free exercise. So, what does this have? What does this say about where we are now? The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a fairly influential player in the world of business. Those sets of scenarios were fairly influential, and you'll see that in the last 10 years, the leading companies, the Shells and the BPs, despite the fact that they've made mistakes in some areas, they are the organisations that are often out ahead of governments in terms of understanding that they have to change their business models if we are to move towards a world of sustainable development. But, of course, 10 years ago, a report 10 years ago doesn't really have much influence now. So they updated it, and just in 2010 they had another report, again, a very optimistic report called Vision 2050, the new agenda for business. In this report, they also acknowledged that things have moved on, that actually the frog scenario is probably the scenario which is the more accurate of the three that they identified before. But there has been some raised consciousness about the necessity for sustainability, even though it's not wide enough. So this vision that they published last year, or in 2010, proposes that the gaps between developed and developing countries will be bridged over the next 50 years, that governments will institute ways to build in the cost of externalities like pollution, that agricultural output will be doubled, deforestation will be stopped, carbon emissions will be halved, there'll be universal access to low-carbon transport, and a tenfold improvement in the efficiency of using materials. And if, only if, those things can be achieved, then by 2050 we'll be living in a world that lives within one Earth's worth of ecosystem materials and services. And they analysed what has to change between now, or 2010, and 2050 in order to achieve that end result. And suggested that there'll be two eras, the two arrows on the left-hand side here, between 2010 and 2020 is what they call the Turbulent Teens, and this is the era in which a lot of the changed values and changed social institutions and political institutions has to occur before the transformation time from 2020 to 2050. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at that and I think, in your dreams, it's not going to happen.
Can you zoom that up a little?
Unfortunately, I can't, but I can give you the web address where you can go and have a look at it yourself. But the idea, the message that I wanted to get across here is that there is significant analysis by people who are expert in their fields, looking at the whole of the world to say what has to change between now and 2050 in order to achieve an ecologically sustainable world. I don't want to go through all of these, but I did want to just point out some of the values that they're suggesting, the human values. This is the trend on the very left-hand side, that has to change, including economic empowerment for women. Now, the good news is that the United Nations has made significant steps in empowering women economically over the last 10 years. But it also includes ensuring that there is a much deeper environmental understanding around the world, that there needs to be changes made through cooperation and building trust between the general public and business. Now, these are not insignificant challenges. And I don't know about you, but I'm much more pessimistic than the people who wrote this report. Having said that, you need to have good analysis, optimistic goals if you want to get anywhere. But there is a more pessimistic view, and thanks to Adam, I recently came across the work of Julian Savulescu, who many of you may know or know of. He's Australian, but now at the University of Oxford as a professor of practical ethics. It seems to me that a lot of the work that needs to be done is really ethical challenges, both at an individual and at a social and political level. And Savulescu, having said that the Business Council had a very optimistic outlook, they did recognise that there were risks, including whether or not people will respond to the logic of scientific data and information. People in this room might, but the people in this room are not representative of people in the street, let alone people who don't have access to education. Will national governments put a price on externalities? There's no, well, people are talking about it at the moment. In fact, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has been running for a number of years a parallel system of accounts. They collect data for the GDP, the gross domestic product, but there is also the development of a parallel set of accounts that takes into account costs such as pollution, other externalities. It's not even got to the stage where governments are talking about whether or not they will adopt a parallel system of accounts or an alternative system of accounts. But as the Business Council points out, that has to happen in the next 10 years, along with a whole lot of other changes. Will countries cooperate or fragment into blocs? I think all you have to do is look at what's happening in Syria to realise that it's unlikely that there's going to be cooperation between countries like the United States and countries like Russia, Brazil, India, China, who are likely to challenge the predominance of the United States in geopolitical terms. So back to Julian Savulescu's alternative and more pessimistic view. Savulescu points out that we have some major problems to face, one of which is that we now have the technological means of mass destruction. There's enough enriched uranium in the world, apparently, for 20,000 atomic bombs, and much of this enriched uranium is not in particularly secure places. But even worse than that, it's cheaper and easier to develop a new form of smallpox, and that's much easier to distribute amongst humanity. So there certainly exists the technological means for mass destruction. But Salusko also points out that there's really serious limitations in human nature. Human nature is not, as we know now, necessarily red in tooth and claw. We do cooperate, there is altruism, but altruism tends to be focused at what we're familiar with. It tends to be tribal, and it tends to focus on the near term rather than the long term. We tend, as individuals, we tend not to, and this is not just an opinion, this is supported by research, we tend not to feel responsible for things that are far away and unfamiliar. Morally, we're more motivated by not doing something harmful than doing something positive to alleviate harm. In other words, we're more concerned with the sins of commission as opposed to the sins of omission, which doesn't look good for the sorts of challenges that the Business Council was posing. And then there's limitations within our political structures. Liberal democracies celebrate self-interest rather than cooperation and tend to defend the maximum of individual freedom. But individual freedom allows antisocial people to flourish. And it just takes a few psychopaths to get access to enriched uranium or to develop a new form of smallpox to really have a major impact. The anonymity of the internet allows for the flourishing of those people who don't take responsibility for creating harm. Our political institutions are not good at generating cooperation at a global level because that sort of cooperation requires long-term thinking. Our political institutions are based on 3 to 5 year political cycles. So we don't have the political institutions that marry well with addressing these major long-term and global problems. So what I wanted to do here was to just take you through one journey of the way that multinational corporations see the role of technology in society. They can see that it can be advantageous, but there are serious issues at the individual ethical, individual psychological level, and serious issues at the social and political and geopolitical level. So how does this relate to people in this room? Firstly, yes, technology is important, but it's not the only factor in thinking about the future. There are other sources of power that are really going to have an influence on technology, the way that it's taken up or not taken up, and the way that it's used. Yes, artificial intelligence may be appealing, but can human nature allow for the ethical development of artificial intelligence? And for the future, we all tend to extrapolate from that with which we're familiar. Everybody in this room, me included, we all tend to think about the future based on what we are familiar with. But the question is, are we going to have a future at all? I'll leave you with another quote from the World Business Council. which is this, that our capacity to absorb new technology may depend less on its availability than on our ability to appreciate its importance, but more to the point, the willingness of society to entertain a change of mind. With the political environment and institutions that we have now, my own view is that there's not going to be an acceptance of artificial intelligence by political institutions that we have now, which raises the question, if artificial intelligence does move forward, if it gets developed, who's going to support it and who's going to benefit? With that, I'll leave it open to questions. Thank you.
If you were to look at your list of what is necessary for sustainability, and you say in your dreams, isn't there this negative feedback that if I realise that others are not going to do this, why don't I just act more selfishly now?
It's the free rider
That's the
situation, yeah. And, there's a lot of research that's been done in psychology to show that whilst we may cooperate, whilst there may be altruism in smaller groups where we can recognise one another and where our bad behaviour can be found out and we can be held to account, beyond that smaller group of mutual recognition, you get the free rider problem, where people give up, and not necessarily give up, but they say, I don't have responsibility. They don't feel a responsibility to act in the best interests of the wider organisation or the wider environment.
But is that likely to be the major short-term effect that actually cuts across any other possibility?
Well, as Savulescu said, this is wired into human nature. Savulescu's recommendation then is to change human nature, either through drugs or through technology.
All very interesting stuff and lots of stuff there that would be worth asking lots of other questions about, but the thing that comes to mind immediately is that, do you think there's any lessons to be learned from the corporate environment for a non-profit organisation that could potentially end up with lots of resources and then attract attention and interest from individuals in the future that are not compatible with the aims and objectives of the founding members and the organisation in the beginning? Is there any sort of...
So do you have a particular organisation in mind?
Yeah.
Which is?
Well, we've got leaflets up front. It's the Neural Archives Foundation.
Right.
Potentially, it could end up with lots of resources, but it's a non-profit, and we want it to be there for a particular reason. But if it attracts lots of people that are interested in the money rather than the aims of the organisation, and the founders have long since been frozen, then how do you control a long-term organisation like that so that its trajectory and its objectives stay true? I mean, there's examples around things like Rotary and other long-term organisations, even the church, I suppose, the Catholic Church or something, have been around for a time. But I don't know if there's any equivalent in the corporate area. A lot of corporates that were around 100 years ago don't exist anymore. So
yeah, creative destruction. My answer to that would be look for the money and the power, because that's what the Catholic Church did and does. It perpetuates itself because it has the resources to do so. Right? And large organisations do the same thing. The problem for not-for-profits is that they have good ideas but not resources. And the question is, how do you gather those resources? You can have intellectual resources, which is fine, but if you want to build an organisation, then you need to have money and you need to have power.
Is
So where do you get that? You're unlikely to get it from people who, law-abiding citizens. Most of the money and power, actually in the internet and in the world, certainly in the internet, is in, most of the internet is in porn. So it's not part of the legitimate, the legal environment. And the black economy within the world, it's not often acknowledged, but it's a significant player. So
Tony?
that's where you're going to get more resources.
Tony has an asked question.
Yes.
Isn't the current period of kind of 30 years of commercial triumphalism is kind of almost become a historical aberration, and to the point where it's unlikely to be sustained much longer, that it's probably in the collapses we've been seeing with global financial crisis and so on are going to just multiply, and we're going to move into some new scenario. And the thing that really seems to have happened is that business, in inverted commas, has become totally preoccupied with defending business models, and we've now got to the point where the population of the individual humans are more amenable to change than businesses, and therefore there's going to be an overturning of this power order, and business is actually going to, as it has every so often, lost its way. And you know, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and that, there's been this kind of, oh yeah, we've won, but we're going nowhere, and that commerce is actually just digging itself a deeper hole, and therefore this coming in from a business-centric view is not addressing a likely global scenario for the future, because it's just going to self-destruct pretty quickly.
Sounds like a pretty classic Marxist analysis to me.
No, Marxism's based on an economy that's gone away. That's based on 19th century economics.
No, it's not actually. I mean, what you said was a classical Marxist analysis, because Marx didn't predict communism as the model that became communism is not what Marx predicted. The question is, what's going to take its place?
Well, yeah, the point really is that what's happened is that business has become just too defensive. It's not proactive, and the individual, with the connected society which we went to yesterday, there's far more ability to innovate outside of business.
I've been on both the inside of business and the outside of business, and I think that there is a misunderstanding by people who are outside of business about what goes on within business. And I think that characterising business as being defensive, that may be true of some, but it's probably true of those who make newspapers. 99% business just gets on with what they're doing. Anyway, I better move on to my other question. Yes.
What do you think a role of an individual can play in sort of impacting any of those future scenarios that the Federation for Sustainability brought up? And sort of what do you think would be sort of the worst, middle and best possible outcomes on an individual level to impact that?
I think the best thing that each one of us can do is keep ourselves informed and urge those around you to keep themselves informed. The worst thing that can happen is apathy. And, you know, frankly, I'm not particularly enamoured of the way that the internet has developed, because I think it actually it draws people into a more passive view, other than, you know, some people true use it in a much more active way, but I think it's a little bit more like, it's becoming more like television, which is a very passive medium. So for you and those around you, urge them to keep an open mind, urge them to keep learning, support education, education, education. because that's what's going to make a difference for those, the next generation of humans who come up. Not just education, but a critical appreciation of the technology. Not assuming that the technology is good in and of itself. You've got to be critical of the technology as well as appreciate its benefits.
It's saying that the capacity to absorb new technology and also other things are meant in that statement, I think the broader it depends on the willingness of society to entertain a change of mind is only one link. And of course there's lots of feedback loops. Society does change its mind quite frequently about certain things, and it depends on what happens. And largely trigger events.
It can, for example, tobacco was a good example. But the sort of changes that the World Business Council was suggesting are really of a different order of magnitude than dealing with something harmful like tobacco. And it's also, they're suggesting, dealing with changes to human nature, what we know about human nature, that human nature tends to cooperate, but only at relatively small groups, not across the globe as a whole. How do you deal with that? It's partly education, but there's a whole lot of parallel changes that have to go on at once. Sorry, there's somebody...
Terry.
Terry?
Meredith,
Yeah.
I love your jazz model, well not your jazz, the jazz model. I've got a question.
That's obviously what they were wanting everybody to think, by the way. So this, you know, that was as much about propaganda as anything else.
Well, I'm wondering, is it your view, to be optimistic perhaps, is it your view that strategic thinking is more important than strategic planning, in the sense that sort of jazz model? I actually saw a very good guitar player a few weeks ago, and he made a joke. He actually Nick Charles from Melbourne. He said, I played a couple of jazz chords in that last song. And now he had to explain the joke. He said, because when they play a wrong note, they call it a jazz chord, so it's a joke in music when they make a mistake by playing jazz. And he actually did say that Shell and BP have made some mistakes with this in front of government. But is that your view, that strategic thinking is more important than strategic planning?
Absolutely, because strategic planning plans within the same paradigm. What they're suggesting here is that you need a new paradigm, socially and politically and geopolitically, in order to achieve a sustainable world by 2050. So strategic thinking gets out of the assumption that the economic model that we're in now is the only way to run things. So that's what they're trying to do with the new scenarios.
One more question.
Sorry, there's somebody up here who had their...
Yeah, I was just going to make a bit of a comment. I've seen a lot of internet forums full of people who are afraid of a one world government of any kind or one world organisation because they feel that that's a 1984 and people are finance and that. I work in marketing and I've seen a massive change towards ethical practices and putting the feel-good factor into environmental things regarding products. So I really feel that we're heading...
So you're feeling optimistic?
...more than anything else in that regard, yeah.
Good for you. Good for you. Have you got time for one last question?
Yeah, sure.
There's a question. Yes.
Could you comment on the emergency gap scenario where businesses funded disinformation, starting with tobacco?
Say the question again.
You talk about tobacco. The tobacco companies funded scientists to muddy the waters to keep their model going for 20 years.
Okay. And you're seeing the same thing with the climate change denialists.
Yeah.
It's an industry and should be recognised as such. The problem is that to legitimate change through governments requires a majority of the person in the street to understand that. And the person in the street is switched off. They're not thinking critically. So what you need to do is get over the passivity of the person in the street so they understand what's being done to them by the merchants of doubt. Exactly.
May I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Are you familiar with any of Matt Ridley's optimistic work? I think it's The Rational Optimist. Do you have any comment on his take of the future, which seems to be quite positive?
I'm not familiar with the detail of it, and I suppose I'd like to be optimistic, but the magnitude of the changes that need to happen and the complexity of the changes that need to happen, I just, personally, I find it overwhelming. And, you know, maybe the transhumanist world is the only saviour. That only if we can get beyond human nature, that is the negative side of human nature, so that we can change the way that society is structured and the political institutions, maybe that's the only hope that we've got in the future. But I have to say that the average person in the street here still sees all this as very fringe. So, you know, good on you for coming along to teach yourselves about these sort of fringe areas. But the linkages have to be made. Eventually, the linkages have to be made to the average person in the street. And what I was trying to do here was to just remind you that there's a whole lot of other players out there, including business, including governments, that they've all got their views about the future as well. And so what you need to do is understand and acknowledge their views so that you're not seen as being somewhat naive in the optimistic scenarios that AI or transhumanism or singularity can present. Okay?